EDHREC is a tool commonly used by Commander players to find data about their favorite commanders and make informed choices about what cards to put in their deck. They help you easily sort through commanders and cards to find out what's commonly played in those commander decks or what commanders are commonly used with cards. Or is it? There are many players who take issue with using other people's deck lists to help you build your own, or even copying other people's decks, sometimes referred to as net decking, and I've heard many people talk about issues with EDHREC's data, and that it can be slowly making its data worse over time. To address the first point, I want to make clear this video is not anti-net decking in any way. Getting all high and mighty about your special deck that immediately folds to any meta deck, and then complaining that those people playing meta decks are uncreative for using MTG Goldfish is pretty lame. The idea that building on the knowledge of predecessors is bad or makes me a worse player is comical. That's just not how knowledge works. Like, not even in Magic, but in general. This is like saying Stephen Hawking was dumb because he started from where Einstein left off, or Einstein was a hack because he used ideas Newton came up with. Learning from your predecessors is totally fine. In Magic, we have 30 years of knowledge to draw from. It's fine to use some of that. Like, I could spend hours and hours and thousands of dollars to test out different strategies, take them to tournaments and build this deck and that deck, or I could take the collective knowledge of many players and play a meta deck. Because after so much testing and brewing, you're probably going to end up in a similar-ish spot. And you also need to know the meta, especially for formats like Modern or Legacy. If you're not ready for Modern Tron or Legacy Painter, then your jank homebrew is going to get steamrolled. And don't get me wrong, I love building off-meta, quirky, weird, funny decks. But I didn't start there, I learned the meta first. And having a concrete meta gives you a chance to break it wide open. Back in 2016, Modern experienced the Eldrazi winter, where new cards like Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher pushed Eldrazi decks to new heights, creating one of the most imbalanced metagames we had ever seen. Yet, out of that, players like Sam Black took time to learn the meta in and out, and then invented a totally new deck, Lantern Control, and took it to some really impressive finishes. But we wouldn't have a deck like Lantern if there was not a specific meta that you need to break. Now, in Commander, I know that the meta is not as concrete as other formats, but your local meta or local friend group can kind of be somewhat similar to your local Modern or Legacy metagame. So let's bring this back to EDHREC. It scours the web to find deck lists, and then uses the data to compile popular cards and suggest cards for your Commander decks. EDHREC recommendations. Over the years, they have added many new features. If you click on combos, you can see popular combos that go into these decks. They have synergy numbers on cards to show you how much more likely a card is to go in that specific commander rather than some random deck in the color combination. And this helps people find niche cards that go into decks very easily without needing to spend a lot of time searching for a card. As an example, I saw someone who was confused about what to do with a Tenewa commander deck. It seems almost impossible to do anything with, since at the beginning of your upkeep, lands you control phase out. But with EDHREC, we can see people play cards like Leyline of Anticipation and Sunder. Leyline of Anticipation lets you flash in all your spells before you lose your lands on your upkeep. And Sunder is a great card to have if you have no lands in play. It bounces all your opponent's lands to their hands because yours are safely phased out. Commanders like Tenewa are really daunting for new players to wrap their mind around, but EDHREC makes it easy to find some of these weird niche cards. So other than people who dislike net decking and that aspect of EDHREC, this all seems well and good, right? Well, there is one slight issue with their data though, and it's partly due to EDHREC's own popularity. Let's say I spend hours and hours crafting a deck list. I've tested it many times, tuned the list, and after a month or two, I post it online, my masterpiece or whatever. That deck list is then scraped by EDHREC and now part of their database. I've affected the data in some small way. Now let's say I go to EDHREC, as an example. Click on a random commander. I got Mikaeus the Lunarch as an example here. I can now click average deck, and it will generate a deck list built from other people's lists. I can now port over my auto-generated deck to many sites very easily, and boom, I now have a deck that is technically finished and legal that I could buy and use at my local game store. Now, as far as building decks quickly, this is pretty much the fastest way to do it. I have a fully legal deck filled with mostly popular cards for this commander, ready to go in seconds. But the problem is, when that list gets posted online, it then goes back into the data pool for EDHREC, and it will be weighed the same as the deck that I spent a lot of time working on. This creates a cycle where the most popular cards on EDHREC get more and more popular as people click on the average deck button and lose cards that are closer to the fringes. As an example of this, I built an average deck with Ragnar, a very unpopular commander, put it on EDHREC, and now Lore got bumped up to one of the top cards because it hit some sort of threshold. This is just a quick, small example of what could happen over time as this occurs. And it's not just the average deck button, right? Any card that is just at the top of EDHREC is gonna be a popular card that people see and use and put in their decks, over time inflating these even higher. Many decks on EDHREC heavily favor cards that do really well or function really well when the commander is in play, and very obviously seems to synergize with the deck, which makes those cards then more popular and more people put them in decks and so on and so forth. But these sort of win more cards that are really good when your commander's in play are often pretty bad to overload your deck on. Let's take a look at this average commander deck from the random commander I got, Cassus. Now, Cassus is not a combo heavy commander, so we're not going to have any issues with stray combo pieces floating around the list. For some commanders, this is something to keep in mind where certain combo pieces might be popular, but maybe parts of the combos are not. Some of them are synergistic and some aren't. So your average list can be a little wonky because of that. Looking at the list, we see 4 board wipes. Not too bad since we're trying to go wide here. 5 pieces of spot removal. So 9 removal spells in total, which is a little bit on the low end. I try to aim for 10 minimum and then 2 to 4 board wipes, depending on the deck and how many tutors I have. But it's not too bad. As for card draw, we have 7 pieces of repeatable card draw. I'm not counting Mind Stone here. I really think 10 is the absolute minimum for repeatable card draw for your deck to have any semblance of consistency, so this is pretty low, especially because the commander does not provide card advantage. Now let's look at the ramp. I'm going to be generous and give Keeper of the Accord and Scholar of New Horizons the pass and say they count as ramp, even though they're conditional and rather slow. But it puts us at 10, which is an okay amount. It might not be the best ramp, but at least it's there. So looking at these metrics, you might be like, oh, the auto-generated deck is not bad. But there are some issues that I think would definitely show up as you actually played and tested the deck. For starters, 33 lands with no cantrips, and a commander whose mana cost is X, meaning we can always use excess mana to pump into the commander. This deck really could use more lands. Honestly, I'd add at least 2 utility lands if possible, since we're in mono white, maybe even more. The second issue here goes along with the data problem I was talking about before, the prevalence of big flashy finishers or win more cards. In Commander, people like to play cards that do big splashy things, especially when it synergizes with their commander. That's fair, we all want to do that. But you can't always eat ice cream, right? Sometimes things go wrong and your commander's not in play, so you're going to need cards that function without your commander. So sticking with Cassus as an example, he is really strong when you have a lot of creatures in play, since you can remove counters to buff up your whole team. So this deck is full of cards that do well when you have a huge board, just like the commander does. Cards like True Conviction and Sigarda's Summons are excellent when you have 15 creatures in play and your commander puts a counter on all of them. But when you have nothing on board, it doesn't do anything. In total, there are 16 cards in the deck that just buff up your team. Abzan Falconer, Honor the Pure, Victory's Envoy, and the commander himself. Now let's compare how many cards actually make a big board for you to use the buffs on. There are 15 in total, so less than the number of buffs. And I'm including cards like Castle Ardenvale, which barely count. They only make 1 token a turn. And I'm also including the Devotion token generators that only really do stuff if you already have other things on board. If your board is empty, there's not a lot of ways to fill your board up in this deck. Cards like Grand Crescendo are not present, even though I'd argue those are some of the most important cards in the deck. Since the commander buffs your team, you need a team to buff more than you need the buffs. Your commander will fulfill a specific role in your deck. So if your commander does something you don't really need other cards in the deck that do the same thing as your commander as much. You still need some because, look, you're not always going to be ahead, you're not always going to have your commander in play, but you're going to consistently be able to get it. And then filling your deck with cards that also only perform when you're ahead is a recipe for disaster, since you're not always going to be ahead. Now, I'm not saying don't play big finishers, because you should. They are fun, and the game does need to end in general, but you want less of them, and more things that function when your commander is not in play or when you have nothing in play. Not every card in your deck needs to be a stellar top deck, but you definitely want to lean towards more of them that are. So in this list, I would be cutting some cards like Honor the Pure and a few other smaller buffs, because the commander already does that in favor of more token generators. So what does all of this mean? Is EDHREC a problem for the commander format? I think the answer is a definitive no. I love this website and I've been using it for many, many years. This is still the first site I show new players when they're trying to build a commander deck. And the auto-generated deck is actually still a decent starting point for a player who doesn't know anything about how to build a commander deck. If you want to learn though, feel free to check out my tutorial here. I mean, I have multiple friends who like playing the game, but don't really like the deck building aspect. So a lot of them enjoy the build a deck feature or just finding videos online of people building cool decks that they think look interesting and then just buying those. And EDHREC has never ever been a deck building website. That was never the intention anyway. It's EDH recommendations. They just recommend cards for you to use. It's not just a full deck list, otherwise it would be a list of deck lists. Also, as the data aggregates more and more, I more and more use EDH backwards. Just because something is a popular card doesn't mean it's actually good or even the best option. There are many, many factors at play. Counterspell shows up in significantly more blue decks than Mana Drain, but Counterspell is objectively a worse card than Mana Drain. But it's like $1, whereas Mana Drain is many dollars. So when looking at data, there's always compounding factors, and you can't just use what's popular on the site as an example of what's the best, especially for your specific deck or specific build. When I was building an Izzet artifact commander, Joyra Weatherlight was the most popular commander for that theme, and still is, for good reason. She has amazing, incredible card advantage. But I built the 5th most popular commander instead. Tawanos works totally differently than other artifact commanders. By doubling up on triggered ability or activated abilities, you want to build your deck in a totally different way with high mana cost or high activation cost abilities and then doubling up those effects. More than that, I built my deck around the card Salvaging Station, which on EDHREC there are only 9 decks that use the card, one of them being me. So with this data, I know that my deck is built around a card almost nobody else uses, in a commander that very few people use, and looking at the other lists, I can be very confident that nobody else is playing Bauble Tribal like me. I know that my deck is a totally different, unique brew to everyone else's, using EDHREC, and I love that. Another example is Grenzo Havoc Raiser. Most decks are Goblin decks for some reason, even though he doesn't do anything with goblins, nor does he really synergize well with their abilities. I know Grenzo is a goblin and gives card advantage when you go wide in a goblin deck, but nothing calls goblins to me about that. Like, drawing random cards off the top of your opponent's deck, that's not going to help you too much with a specific tribal deck. So mine, built as a power 2 or less matters commander, focusing on the goat aspect, shows me that my deck is totally different and unique than other people's Grenzo decks. I think EDHREC is the best tool out there for commander players to use, period. It lets me build unique, spicy decks that I know are different or weird compared to other people's. And I personally love that aspect. But it's also a tool for new players to easily put together decks. It does both. And because of this, even though the data does homogenize over time, and even though it does kind of create a self-fulfilling prophecy by pumping in its own data that it spits out, it's still really useful. And just like any other data source, the more you know about how the data comes in, where it's being used, how it's being used, the more you can utilize that and leverage it for whatever you need. So that's why I love EDHREC, and I don't think it's a problem for the format at all. Although I know there's a lot of people, especially online, that have argued with me about this. So let me know in the comments below what you think about everything I've said. I know I use Arcane Denial as an example of an overplayed card or card that's only played because it's popular. I stand by that. whole separate video about it. I recommend checking that out if you want to argue more in the comments over there. Thank you so very much for watching. Subscribe for more.